Hello and welcome to Press TV News Analysis. I'm Kaveh Tathwai. People kicking windows of shops, looting, police deployed with dogs, grabbing people on the ground and making arrests. Just some of the scenes that erupted first in Tottenham and then spread to many boroughs of London. It became evident that the peaceful protest against the shooting death of a black father of four, Mark Duggan, was the spark that brought out the anger of many residents, which, as one city councillor put it, was due to austerity and budget cuts. Is this the beginning of wide social unrest in the UK? Well, let me introduce our guest for this edition of Press TV News Analysis. From London, we have Mark Wadworth, who's a political activist, joining us. Saab Shah, who's author and Middle East Affairs expert, joins us from Belfast. And rounding off the list, Larry Burns, Director of the Council on Hemispheric Affairs, joins us from Washington. I want to welcome all my guests in this edition of Press TV News Analysis. Mark Wadsworth, let me go to you first. How worried should Prime Minister David Cameron be, who's on summer vacation in Tuscany and is planning to take a second summer holiday?
He should be very worried indeed. There's a huge amount of upset and grievance at the shooting to death by police of a 29-year-old black man, Mark Duggan, and the disrespect shown to his family. Days after that terrible event, they've been ignored. They haven't been given any answers as to what happened to their loved one, how it came to be that he was shot dead by police.
Well, Saab Shah, before we get into really what's at the core here, this is being analyzed in terms of the way the police conducted itself. We had our guest there, Mark Wadworth, talk about how Duggan was dealt with. And of course, the comparison now is being made to the death of Jean-Charles de Menezes. He was shot 8 times by the police. And then the singer, Smiley Culture. Police conduct is under question in all of these cases, isn't it?
It is. When you see the police deal with the local youth as they are criminals, stop them, pull them over all the time, specifically if they are black men. And the police never, talk to local community leaders. They ignore them. Exactly that's what drove the people anger, that the police were talking to the media, but not to Mr. Dogg's family. With the existing racial tension between the locally black youth and the largely white metropolitan police, you expect that something to happen, and it is unforgivable. You cannot forgive that the police refuse dialogue. We know the history here. How can Tottenham have a guy killed by police on Thursday and resist requests for dialogue from the community 48 hours later? Let me just say further. When you see the government engaged in the process of cutting essential services and slashing jobs, and do not see or care about driving people into deeper poverty, and only taking care of the big corporations and the less than 1% wealthy who runs those companies, while they deprive people facing hardship and abuse. When a family asks why the police killed their own son and why the police won't meet them or provide them with answers, those people will definitely get angry and will express their anger through a riot. Then they shall be heard, and then they will get some answers. But I warn, this will spread because the government has to take action in addressing the reasons laying underneath all of that. If I may go ahead, Tottenham is a deprived area, already has the highest unemployment rate in London. People were suffering long before this riot. Tottenham known by its own poverty, with unemployment level topping 20%. Thousands of people grow up in that area without work, without even hope.
And looking at that, the unemployment among Britain's 16 to 25-year-olds has hit the record 1 million mark. Larry Burns, when we want to really analyze what has occurred in terms of the boroughs, these are pretty much economically challenged or disadvantaged neighborhoods that it's occurred, which include blacks and minorities. Very combustible, given that the Chancellor is squeezing £18 billion from welfare spending over the next 4 years. And these are on those who have too little to begin with. So isn't that what is sparking and fueling these protests that we're seeing?
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic with your analysis. I think that it probably is more germane than going after the police on this. It really becomes an issue of broad social policy. Where are the Tories in terms of social justice issues, educational availabilities, there's very little reason to believe that you're going to find much humanitas in the attitudes of the upper reaches of the British government. I think it probably is a mistake to get caught up into the sectarian issues of exactly what's happening or what the police did or did not. The police are a security force, and they have weapons. Those weapons are authorized by the civil society. Unfortunately, civil society isn't always reflective of the policy revelations that take place in the country itself. And I'm very much seized by the fact that in recent weeks, months, there have been issue after issue where budgetary allocations that would benefit the poor were dried up and severed. And this, of course, is going to have immediate implications on the population, because the general population, particularly the poverty-stricken regions of Greater London, they're going to be directly affected by the consequences of what's taking place. And as a result of this, you have a downward spiral, and this downward spiral is going to be increasingly fueled by the fact that there are global issues involved here: the increasing shortage of food, the increasing cost of food, the increasing cost of water. That is, these are all maladies that the poor aren't equipped to handle because they don't have the necessary resources of education and skills to enable them to bail out of this situation. Mm-hmm. And I think that what we're seeing here is just the beginning of a process that's going to bring a lot of grief with it.
Right, and I didn't mean to demonize it. If I did, that was not my intention of the police. But let's look at that, Mark Wadworth. Regarding these communities, there's been a long history of police harassment, hasn't there? Stop and search has been cited as one of them. Without any reason, they can stop and search you on the street. And a lot of the black youth feel they are being harassed consistently over the last years, and not to mention the large Arab and Bengali population. So it's not just...
Absolutely.
So you have that, and then you have the cuts. You have the youths, as an example, whose youth services have been cut. So this combined together is what we're witnessing on the streets, isn't it?
Absolutely. Youth services cut by a dramatic 75% in Haringey, which is the borough that accommodates Tottenham. And, you know, I have sons. I want them to respect authority, but authority doesn't respect them on the streets. They are racially profiled as black young people, and you know, this creates huge resentment. And we have a crisis of policing. But let's remember who are behind the police. It's the state. They are, as we heard earlier, the security force of the state. They do the bidding of the state. And what really concerns me is that the whole issue of injustice, the injustice to Mark Duggan, the injustice to his family, is being lost. And now the debate is being skillfully skewed onto the right-wing law and order agenda, including by the Tottenham MP, by the Home Secretary, by Nick Clegg. And it needs to be pulled back now to the issue of social justice, economic justice, political justice for the black people that are still suffering oppression after the slaying of Mark Duggan, and before that, Cynthia Jarrett in 1985, which led to an uprising that's quite famous on the Wadworth Farm estate, and then Joy Gardner and Roger Sylvester, who was actually arrested naked outside his home. We don't know whether he was actually stripped and humiliated by a police force that wants to teach black people a lesson and seems to have a license to kill. And if these authorities, as I was on Sky TV News just a moment ago with an ex-police commander, and he was talking about the answer is to bring in bigger weaponry, water cannon, plastic bullets, and that will just create a war in the inner cities, and that's not what we want. Our war should be against poverty, against injustice, against racism. And that's what the youth are now seizing their opportunity. They are the voiceless, and they are now demanding to be heard.
Given the fact that if we were to pretend that these developments are going to get more severe, Saab Shah, it's very interesting that Mark Wadworth talks about the police, that ex-commander, saying we need more weapons. Curious what you may think about David Cameron and his government about the police, whether they're going to handle it, because the police themselves have been on the receiving end of budget cuts. 34,000 police jobs lost as part of government cuts, 20% budget cuts there. Even the police are saying that there's going to be an increase in crime. Morale has fallen within the police, and that 75% saying that the cutting of officers will lead to more crime. How do you see the way the police is going to act out on the streets, given that these developments will continue as it's been?
I notice the authorities, while even this leadership, all of them in holidays, from Theresa May to David Cameron to George Osborne to even Boris Johnson, the London mayor, all of them enjoying their holidays while this mayhem going on. And they all behind increasing the number of the policing and controlling just profiled areas. Even in their elections, if we see the patterns of their election, they target just some areas with some wealth. That's their electorate for the Labour Party or for the Conservative Party. And if they are focusing on areas, if we go back to 1985 and Broadwater Farm Uprising, we're still witnessing a community riddled with inequality and disadvantages. Too many in the tunnel still face poverty and unemployment, and the government tried to even improve any of these conditions. Overcrowded housing, they have not are living beside each other, so they can see in London area who is extremely wealthy and who is extremely poor. The London young people in Tottenham were angry in '85, and they are still very angry today, because none of the issues they rose in 1985 to change and to get justice and equality have ever been addressed. Only the government keep profiling them and ignoring them, and treat the youth in that area like they are zero. They don't exist, dehumanizing them even, and treat them with brutality, absolute brutality. That is the kind of policies which seen on the ground. It's nice to hear the right wing or even the left wing debating that, but what's the facts on the ground? The facts on the ground, those youth are hopeless, and the only way they can get heard is through rioting, and that is the message now is beaming everywhere. We hope there is decent politicians left who can deal with this, because I see this is going to spread and spread more and more all over the UK, since the government is only concerned, as I mentioned earlier on, about the multinationals, about the corporations, about the 1% wealthy, and ignoring the rest of the population.
And it just seems one problem after another there, Larry Burns. You have austerity cuts from the debt, a possible double-dip recession, economy that's not really recovering. You have the most recent hacking scandal, high-profile police resignations and corruption, which may extend beyond a handful of officers, and the budget scandals. The list goes on. The UK is reeling in problem after problem. So this has led to the dissatisfaction of the coalition government, and the anger that has just kept mounting and mounting because of all this. So do you think it's a series of these events that is translating into what we're seeing on the ground?
Everything that we've said on this program up to this point is entirely justified and hardly can be called an extremist remedy or an extremist accusation. And what's interesting is that the problems that are affecting a given country and a given city and a given neighborhood are really reflective of a much broader horizon, which takes in the world. And increasingly there's going to be the whole challenge posed by immigration, people desperately trying to get out of countries that predictably they will starve if they stand put where they are. This comes against a political scenario where the local existing population is unhappy about new immigrants, particularly that they bring different characteristics to society than the original inhabitants are used to. With all of this presents huge problems that the rhetoric that is being used by the forces of the status quo, as typified by Mr. Cameron and the cabinet that exists there, is that it's light years away from being relevant to the kinds of things that are happening throughout Africa and in Europe with its immigration problems and so forth. We have to come up with a plan, with a rhetoric that is suitable, that is applicable, that makes sense. And we have to look upon the world as a community problem, and this divisiveness that occurs.
So Larry Burns, let me jump in and ask you, what solution do you propose for David Cameron when he's looking at what he's seeing right now, the images on the screen?
Well, I think that what he has to decide is what are the budgetary imperatives, what really should go, what really should stay, and what are appropriate activities for the state to engage in. And fundamentally, of course, is the well-being of the population. And unless the government is able to come up with a program that is relevant to the status quo, you're going to invite a continuation of the kind of tragedy that we're witnessing now, which we've seen before in key cities throughout the United States. That these riots have taken place globally as well, here, there, everywhere. And they're bound to continue and bound to enlarge and bound to become more and more poisoned because they reflect terrible realities that, unless they are dealt with, will continue to fuel the social fire that we're now witnessing.
Mark Wadworth, Britain is not the country that it was just a few years ago. Do you agree at a fundamental level the state has been weakened, confidence in its guardians, as some are saying, the politicians, the police, even the press, it has been eroded. What can David Cameron do to bring this confidence back?
Yes, of course, there's a lack of engagement on a civil level. Black young people joined by white young people, disaffected, the oppressed, are rising up and rebelling because they do not feel a part of this society. The media typecasts them or excludes our voices. That's why we've got thelatest.com as social media that I edit and founded. We've got Twitter, we've got Facebook, we've got alternatives now to big media that do all these horrible things to us. And the political class is being challenged as well. I'm a part of a campaign now to get a fair deal of the Olympics that are coming up. £9 billion being spent on Olympics that's effectively in a white Olympics, and those Olympics will burn unless there's social justice. That's why we've got this campaign. Can you see this flyer here? Yeah?
I can see from this distance. What does the flyer say?
The big rip-off. The fact that only 6% of black, Asian, minority, ethnic businesses have got contracts according to official figures. That might be a gross underestimate. We deserve and demand a fair share of the pie in this society. And if we don't get it, then I'm sorry to say, as Martin Luther King said, the riot is the voice of the unheard. And we're going to see a very hot summer indeed around the whole of the UK, not just London.
Let me get a reaction from Larry Burns, our guest Mark Wadworth. He lives in London. You could feel the anger that he has, the gripes that he has. What is your reaction when you heard Mark Wadsworth there, Larry Burns?
Well, I heard the language of despair and bitterness. No, he's there, he's watching, he's experiencing. I can understand all of that. I'm just trying, as he was speaking, I'm just trying to race through my mind. What would I do if I was there? What did I see when I actually went to school there? And my conclusion is the provisional one, is that all of this, nothing should be sacrosanct or beyond the negotiating table. And the same kind of imagination and adventurism and the spirit of the quest that often goes beyond the negotiation of big issues concerning important aspects of societal arrangement, that this should be viewed in the same spirit, with the same sense of the hugeness of the problem and the necessity of solution.
Larry Burns, I don't quite understand what you mean by the negotiating table. The people came out, they voted. That was the negotiating table. They voted for David Cameron. They voted for Nick Clegg, the coalition government of which Nick Clegg lied to them, in which we saw what happened with the education cuts that happened. And on top of that, then the austerity cuts across the board. I mean, wasn't that the negotiating table, the voting that took place, and then when they were lied to by Nick Clegg?
Yeah, well, what is the alternative? The alternative is the very uncertain process of creating extra-constitutional solutions. And since the authorities usually have more guns and more dogs and more of everything than the general population is going to suffer the consequences of this. Responsible leadership really demands that the leadership take place. And I think that Martin Luther King's entire life was a vindication of that thesis. And you just don't give up on a process because it may not be working at this particular juncture. You keep on working at it. You keep on trying.
Okay, we're running quick out of time. Let me bring in Mark Wadworth. Mark Wadworth, since you're in London, give us a final thoughts for closing this program.
Yeah, my final thoughts are that these people who rule over us but should actually be public servants will condemn violence in the inner cities, and yet they are the most violent perpetrators of militarism against countries like Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Libya. So they're complete hypocrites, and that there must be now a dialogue, a real engagement with the dispossessed and the disengaged. And we are providing that opportunity. If they want to come and talk to us, we're prepared now to engage in discussions about how social justice is delivered and how we get a fair slice of the pie, because the alternative is too terrible to contemplate.
Mark Wadworth, thank you very much. Political activists from London with the statements. We had earlier Sav Shah, author and Middle East affairs expert from Belfast with his statements, and Larry Burns, thank you, Director of Council on Hemispheric Affairs from Washington. Thank you for watching this edition of Press TV News Analysis. Send us any questions you may have, newsroom@presstv.ir. From me, Kaveh Tapley, and the entire team, it's goodbye.